In this lesson, you will learn how to identify and write seventh chords and their inversions. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to identify and label seventh chords by root and quality. You should be able to spell seventh chords given one element of the chord and its quality. And you should be able to identify and write seventh chords in inversions. If you can identify and spell triads, then you can identify and spell seventh chords. Seventh chords are simply triads with an additional third on the top. In root position, they can be written on 4 adjacent lines or 4 adjacent spaces. On the slide, you will see all of the diatonic seventh chords in the key of C major. You'll remember that a triad consists of only 3 notes. Therefore, it's important to refer to seventh chords as chords, not triads, because they consist of 4 notes. Seventh chords are identified by the quality of the triad and the quality of the seventh. The seventh chord built on scale degree 1 of a major key is a major seventh chord. It consists of a C major triad, and the seventh from C to B is a major seventh. It's abbreviated with 2 capital M's. The seventh chords on 1 and 4 in a major key will be major. Sometimes they're just called major seventh chords for short. The seventh chords built on scale degrees 2, 3, and 6 are minor because they consist of a minor triad and a minor seventh above the root. They're abbreviated with 2 lowercase m's and are sometimes called just minor seventh chords. The seventh chord built on scale degree 5 is a major minor seventh chord. It contains a major triad and a minor seventh above the root. It's often called the dominant seventh, and because of its unique characteristics and its uniqueness to the scale, it is the most common type of seventh chord in tonal music. We'll talk more about this next quarter when we get into things like cadences and part writing. The seventh chord built on scale degree 7 is a diminished minor triad. It has a diminished triad and a minor seventh above the root. It's often called a half diminished seventh, and we'll see actually a fully diminished seventh chord in just a minute. We see many of the same kinds of seventh chords in the minor mode. Take a minute to study the slide, pause the video perhaps, and note the kinds of seventh chords in the minor scale. Because we raised the leading tone, the seventh chord on scale degree 5 is still a dominant seventh. As was the case with triads, we have 2 possible chords built on scale degree 7. If we keep the subtonic, we have a major minor seventh chord. If we use the leading tone, we have a diminished seventh chord consisting of a diminished triad and a diminished seventh above the root. These are often called fully diminished seventh chords. This chart encapsulates much of the information presented on the previous 2 slides. The 5 possible qualities of seventh chord appear in the leftmost column. The second column gives their nicknames, as it were. The middle column shows the lead sheet symbols for each quality. The last 2 columns show you which diatonic chords in which modes have each quality. To spell seventh chords, all you need to do is spell the requested triad and then add a seventh above the root of that triad. For example, if you were asked to spell an E minor seventh chord, you would first spell an E minor triad, E, G, B, and then you would add a minor seventh above E, which is D. An E minor seventh chord is thus E, G, B, D. The same principle holds true if you're asked to, say, spell a major minor seventh chord whose third is B. You would first build a triad that has B as the third, in this case a G major triad, and then you would add a minor seventh above G, which is F. If you're given the seventh of the chord, you do precisely the opposite. You find the note that is a seventh below the given note, then use that as the root of the appropriate triad. If you were asked to build a major seventh chord whose seventh is F sharp, first you find the note that's a major seventh below F sharp. Hint, It's the same as the note a minor second above F sharp. Remember interval inversions? Once you've determined that note, in this case G, you build a major triad on G. And the correct answer is G, B, D, F sharp. Just as with triads, any element of a seventh chord, the root, third, fifth, or seventh, can be in the bass. Here's an E flat major seventh chord, note the lead sheet symbols above, in root position and all three inversions. There's an easy way to determine the root of an inverted seventh chord. You'll notice that all of the inversions include a second. Here's a second, here's a second, and here's a second. The root of the chord is always the higher note of the second. In this case it's E flat, an E flat major seventh chord. The second here, E flat is the top note. The second here, E flat is the top note. The second here, E flat is the top note. This slide shows the full figured bass for the E flat major seventh chord that we saw on the last slide. Notice again that the figures simply indicate intervals above the bass note. These would all get Roman numeral 4 in the key of B flat. As with triads, composers occasionally take the easy way out and abbreviate the figured bass. The shorthand figures for inversions of seventh chords are indicated here in red. You need the 7 in root position to distinguish a seventh chord from a root position triad. First inversion is indicated by 6, 5. We have a sixth above the bass and a fifth above the bass, and the third is implied. Second inversion implies the sixth and tells us we have a fourth and a third above the bass. And third inversion tells us 4, 2, and again the sixth is implied. Sometimes in third inversion you'll only see the figure 2, so if you see 2 and not 4, 2, that's still a third inversion seventh chord. Now, you just met seventh chords, and this is crazy, but here's their number, so call them maybe. The phone number is actually a good way to remember the figured bass for inversions of both triads and seventh chords. The area code gives you the figured bass for first and second inversion triads. 6 for first inversion, 6-4 for second inversion. The rest of the number gives you the figures for seventh chords. 7 for root position, 6-5 for first inversion, 4-3 for second inversion, and 4-2 for third inversion. Please don't call this number. There's a poor little old lady in Omaha, Nebraska who is tired of taking phone calls from my students. But you should remember it nonetheless. To show you some seventh chords in action, I want to revisit a piece that we looked at a little while ago. It's the first prelude from Book 1 of Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier. There's a link to the score for this piece on the Canvas page that you should open if you haven't yet, and take a moment to listen to the piece a few times so that you become familiar with it. There's also a link to a YouTube clip of a good performance. On the screen, you'll see a rhythmic reduction of the piece. I've turned all of the 16th note figuration into just half notes. And I mentioned in a previous lesson that Bach's manuscript of the piece actually does just this. He only writes 16th notes for the first couple of measures and writes the rest of the prelude as half notes. I've labeled all of the harmonies in these first dozen measures or so with lead sheet symbols above the staff and Roman numerals and figured bass below. You can see the interactions between triads and seventh chords in root position and various inversions. Listen to the piece again, and this time follow along on the rhythmic reduction. You'll notice that about halfway through it changes to the key of G major. You don't need to worry about how or why it does that, but just know that once we get into the second line, these Roman numerals all apply to the key of G major, not C major. So at this point you should be able to identify and label seventh chords by root and quality. You should be able to spell seventh chords given one element of the chord and its quality. And you should be able to identify and write seventh chords in inversion. As always, post any questions you might have to the discussion board on Canvas, and feel free to answer questions posed by your classmates. Be sure to take the quiz. You can take it as many times as you'd like and use whatever materials you have, but you have to score 100% before coming to class on Monday.